Welcome back, guys. And you guys already know, had a really terrible week last week. Lost 8.77 units and basically just got swept across the board here. And, a number of fighters choked, in my opinion, but I got to take responsibility for having exposure to some of these fighters. And, that's just how it is. It's part of the betting game. We'll have these hot streaks, we'll have these cold streaks. And, recently I've had quite a bit of a bad streak and honestly just looking to bounce back here. And I'll keep doing this for as long as my bankroll holds up, which might not be long at this rate, but honestly, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to make a comeback here. And, who knows? Maybe I'll just do the breakdowns and avoid some of the betting tips for a while. But who knows? We'll see how things play out. But I'm pretty certain I'll bounce back. And taking a look back, I just got to settle down a little bit. Maybe just lock in more reliable fighters, even if I have to eat the chalk here. I've been getting a little trigger happy with some of these picks, and honestly, have gone pretty full degenerate trying to chase that big winning night, and just really gotta settle down, really focus a bit more. So, without further ado, let's just get right into these breakdowns. Jared Vanderaa versus Sergey Spivak, where Vanderaa is the plus 180 underdog here, and Spivak is the minus 210 favorite, and this is a pretty interesting heavyweight fight, right? Spivak is, not Spivak. Vanderaa is making his UFC debut, and taking a look at some of his fights, I wasn't able to find too much tape on him. Just a few fights that I think were on Fight Pass and YouTube. But in his fight against Hunsucker, I believe that was a Dana White's Contender Series fight. And, he ate a few bombs from Hunsucker, showed a lot of toughness there, so I think he has that going for him. But, he was able to get Hunsucker down and basically just win via ground and pound after just eating a ton of punches from Hunsucker. And I was able to find a fight, him versus Richard Odoms. And basically in that fight, just a lot of cage pushing on both ends. It was a very sloppy kind of grappler type of fight, and I remember at one point in the fight he did get the back of Odom, but did eventually get reversed, and later in the fight did actually lose to Kimura by Odom. And there was an old ass fight on Fight Pass where it was against Rizzo, and honestly that was kind of a joke of a fight where Rizzo just tapped to the softest rear naked choke. It barely looked like it was locked in, and he had the quickest tap ever. It was kind of pathetic. So it was, they were both making their debuts, their pro debuts, and it was a really long time ago, so I don't think you could read into that too much. But kind of just flipping through the record of Vanderaa here, it does look like he struggles with submissions. He has a number of submission losses, and from what I've seen, from what I saw in his Odom fight, it looks like his top control isn't particularly good. It seems he just relies a bit on his size, where he'll lean up against his opponent up against the cage and just land some ground and pound there. Honestly, he doesn't seem really good or skilled. He just seems like a big guy and has really just been able to abuse his size in the octagon. On the feet, though, he's not particularly quick. He's kind of a slow guy and is a bit flat-footed. The only thing he really has going for him is his durability. So he's able to eat a ton of punches and eventually just close the distance to where he's able to just push you up against the fence where he'll do the majority of his work. Spivak, on the other hand, has a pretty similar fight style in that he loves to just grind his opponents out as well. The only difference is, though, I'd say Spivak is much more technical with his wrestling, has a lot better top control, and is a little more athletic. He is going to be giving up a bit of size in this matchup, but I think that's just because Spivak isn't a super fat heavyweight like some of the other, or a lot of the other heavyweights for that matter. But Spivak, he's actually in pretty good shape. He is a little small for the division, but that's just because I think he has a pretty low body fat percentage compared to a lot of these other heavyweights. I'm sure if he could easily put on 10, 20 pounds of fat, but it makes him a little quicker for the division. But the concern here is he is giving up a good amount of size on Vanderaa, and we saw that in his fight against Tybura. He did struggle with the grappling of Tybura, where Tybura was able to just outmuscle him. But something to consider, though, is that Tybura is a much higher level heavyweight than Vanderaa. Vanderaa, I don't see too much, wrestling from him. He's just a big guy who's able to lean up against opponents. So I actually do really like Spivak in this matchup. I think he's just the more polished fighter, the better wrestler here. I think he's much more technical on the feet, on the ground. So overall, I think he's just the better fighter. The only problem is he's giving up a good amount of size, and I'm really concerned that maybe Vanderaa is just able to hold Spivak up against the cage, up against the cage, possibly take him down and hold him there. But from what I've seen in some of his other fights, Vanderaa is able to get reversed. His jiu-jitsu is not particularly good, and with Spivak, I think he has the better jiu-jitsu, so he could potentially sub him. I do definitely think that Spivak is the more proven fighter. He does have UFC fights under his belt, and Vanderaa, he's fought pretty low-level opponents so far, and he's had a number of losses on the regional scene as well. So as far as how the fight is going to play out, I think that Spivak's going to have the advantage on the feet. I think that if he initiates the takedown, I think he should be able to get Vanderaa down, possibly hold him there, and maybe even get the submission. So the pick here is going to be Spivak. At minus 200, I don't know if I want to just play him straight. I really like Spivak here, and I definitely think he's all around just the better fighter, the more experienced fighter, the more technical fighter, and he might be the guy that I have to lay the chalk on, because looking at the rest of the card, I'm not really sold on anyone else. So I might just go with Spivak here. I haven't locked anything in yet, but I'm really looking at it. I really do like Spivak. The main concern is the size, but I think he should be able to get it done here. So pick a Spivak. Really looking at putting in a bet here. Haven't locked it in yet, and once the props come out, I might put a little bit on Spivak by submission as well. Aiemann Zahabi versus Draco Rodriguez, and Aiemann Zahabi is the plus 155 underdog against Draco Rodriguez, who is the minus 180 favorite. And let's start with Aiemann Zahabi here, where, let's be real, if it wasn't for his name, I don't think he'd be in the UFC. But taking a look at his UFC stint here, he did get matched up with Reginaldo Vieira in his UFC debut, where it was a really questionable decision in my opinion. But outside of that second round where he got the knockdown, I don't think he was having too much success, and I think he definitely could have scored it in favor of Vieira, but it did seem like he got a bit of a rub there. Then he got matched up with Ricardo Ramos, and honestly, he wasn't doing too bad in that fight for the first couple of rounds. He was holding his own for a bit. He was giving a lot of trouble to Ramos with his jab and his uppercut, but he was getting jabbed up by Ramos as well. And in the third round, he ended up eating not one but two spinning elbows before getting knocked out. Then he ends up taking almost 2 year off when most fighters would be in their prime. He takes a couple years off before facing Vince Morales, where honestly he just wasn't able to get it going in that fight. Super low output, and pretty much got picked apart by Morales. And at the end of the day, I think it just comes down to the athleticism of Zahabi, which isn't really there. Morales was really just a bit too quick for Zahabi, was able to dart in and out of the pocket, land a few punches, dart out, and Zahabi was never really able to just get anything going. And I think that really is just the problem with Aiemann here, who isn't really a high-level athlete. In my opinion, he's just a pretty average dude who had the benefit of training at a really high-level gym and maybe getting a lot of good looks with high-level training partners, and that could probably get him, pretty far in the regional scene. It seems he's been doing pretty well there, but this isn't fucking Naruto. This is the UFC, where hard work doesn't just cut it. You have to have athleticism, you have to be talented to a certain extent, and obviously you need the hard work, but you really need all of these other factors as well. And at 33, we've more or less seen the best of Aiemann Zahabi at this point. I think that even with an additional year or so off, I don't think he's making any crazy improvements. I don't think he's getting any stronger, any faster. So it's going to be rough for Zahabi here. But on the flip side, he hasn't been drawing fights against the highest level opponents. So the UFC's been matching him up with pretty low-level prospects, in my opinion. Like Draco Rodriguez, I haven't been able to find a ton of tape on him, but as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't seem like a really hyped prospect or anything. They are kind of handing him, I guess, softballs in terms of matchups, but I think that anyone that's made it out of the regional scene will give Zahabi a lot of trouble. That being said, though, I'm not actually sure that Draco Rodriguez is actually a solid, prospect. He's had pretty soft competition up until this point, and the only fight I was able to find on him was the Mana Martinez fight, where he was able to get the sub pretty early. But from what I've seen, he does seem pretty explosive, swings pretty hard, and has some decent scrambling ability and solid BJJ. But it was against, I'd say, a pretty low-level opponent. So this is definitely a winnable fight for Zahabi. I think that, technically he might have better skills. I mean, he is training out of a really, solid gym, and they teach some really good fundamentals there. But again, really, it's just the athleticism of Zahabi that I'm really concerned about, and he hasn't really shown anything that really wows me or makes me want to put money on him. So, as unknown of a factor as Rodriguez is, I have no faith in Ayman Zahabi. And the thing is, he's taken another year and a half off. And I really don't think that he'll be making crazy improvements. That year and a half off between Ramos and Morales, he did look a little bit better, but Morales was still able to completely outclass him. And Rodriguez definitely isn't on the level of Morales, but I don't think Zahabi is going to be making any massive improvements. I think that, maybe his footwork will improve a little bit. Maybe his boxing will be a little bit crisper, but I don't think we're going to be seeing crazy changes from Morales. Whereas with Rodriguez, at least, he's been somewhat active. He did fight late last year in 2020. And he's still pretty young, so he could be making, some improvements. But as far as how this fight will go, I can't give anything solid here since there's not a lot of tape on Rodriguez. But just based off of, the 2 minutes I've seen from him, I think that he'll likely be beating Zahabi to the punch. He might be the stronger, quicker fighter in there. And for that reason, I'm just going to have to go with Rodriguez, but not super confident. And at where the price sits right now, minus 180 for Rodriguez, I don't want to lay minus 180 for someone who's that big of an unknown, even if it is against Zahabi, who I think is pretty low level. So the pick here is Rodriguez. No bet, not confident at all at this. I think that, I'm just going to lean on the athleticism. Jamal Emmers versus Chaz Skelly. And Emmers is going to be the minus 230 favorite here. And the comeback on Skelly is going to be plus 195. And let's start with Emmers, who I actually really like. I feel like Emmers could definitely make a solid run in the UFC. And I think it was kind of unfortunate that Emmers lost his Contender Series fight against Erosa, because if he had won that, I think he would have been able to kickstart his UFC career a little earlier, but instead he got head kicked, got knocked out, and instead Erosa was the one who got the UFC contract and didn't really give a good account of himself. I honestly feel that had Emmers gotten the contract, he would have done a lot better in the UFC, but what ended up happening was he had to prove himself again in the regional scene. Was able to make his UFC debut against Giga Chikadze about a bit over 2 years after, or I guess about 2 years after his Contender Series loss, and gave a decent account of himself, had kind of questionable fight IQ in that fight. He definitely could have taken that fight to the ground and ground Chikadze out for a decision, but instead he kept it standing for a bit longer than necessary and ended up losing a split decision. But I think he ended up taking a bit of damage at the beginning, either from like a check hook or a counter hook early in the fight, and I think that stunned him. Might have fucked with his decision making there, but and he did end up taking the fight down in the second and third round, but it was a little bit too little too late. And honestly, he didn't give too bad of an account of himself, considering Chikadze was a very, very high level kickboxer coming into the UFC. And he did bounce back against Vince Cachero in his most recent fight, where he was the much bigger guy. I think Cachero was coming in late and was moving up a weight class. There was a pretty noticeable size difference in that fight. But Emmers did work in that fight. He absolutely rolled on Cachero there and won a pretty dominant decision. But as far as what Emmers does well, he mixes it up very well, honestly. He's a pretty well-rounded fighter. I really like his boxing. He has great head movement, very quick, great combinations. Really good at mixing it up on the feet and keeping you guessing. But what I really like about him as well is his ability to mix it up and shoot for the takedown as well. His wrestling is very much a part of his game. The fact that he's so competent on the feet really opens up the wrestling. The fight, a lot of fighters don't really see it coming, so he is able to time that takedown really well and landed at a pretty high clip. And he does mix in the wrestling a lot in the later part of a round to, I'd say usually in like the last minute or two, to really secure the round because, as dominant as he is on the feet, the wrestling is really what wins him the decisions. And I think he's a pretty solid wrestler too. I mean, he's not elite or anything, but the fact that he is able to mix it in is a really good look. And taking a look at his opponent, Skelly, I feel that at this point in his career, Skelly is a bit one-dimensional. He's not going to offer much on the feet and is more of just a grinder, right? So what he'll look to do really is just to grind you up against the cage, maybe look to backpack you and kind of just grind out the decision. He's might look for the submission, but outside of that, I don't think he'll have much to offer in this fight. So I definitely feel that if Emmers is able to keep this fight standing, he should be able to piece Skelly up pretty badly here. At this stage in his career for Skelly, I mean, he's a bit older. He's 35. He's coming off of an injury, and he's been taking really just long periods of time off. I mean, his last fight was in 2019, and before that it was in late 2018 and then 2017. So all the time off, the age and the injury is, I mean, not looking good for Skelly at all. I feel that his really only path to victory here is to grind up on Emmers and maybe just make it a really long, grindy, boring fight and possibly get the submission, but I don't see that as I don't think that's very likely since he's going to be giving up a ton of size against Emmers. Emmers is a quick dude. He's very strong and pretty big for the division. So, yeah, I really don't see Skelly being able to gain much control time on Emmers in this fight. So more than likely, I think this fight will stay standing, or rather, I see Emmers being the one that's controlling where the fight is going to go. I think if he wants it to be standing, it'll be standing. If he wants to take it down to the ground, it'll go to the ground. But I see Emmers honestly just winning a pretty dominant decision here. So the pick here is going to be Emmers. The only concern I do have with Emmers, though, is he does seem to choke a little bit in these big fights, or when he gets a big step up in competition, like when in his first fight outside of the regional scene on the Contender Series, he did lose to Erosa, did lose to Chavez in his debut. So maybe he's gotten all the jitters out, and he seems to be in a good place now. So I'm gonna have to go with Emmers. And as far as a bet goes, nothing locked in just yet, but I might be looking to parlay him. I'm thinking possibly with Spivak, but I'm not sure yet. I'm going to have to go through the rest of this card, but right now I'm really liking Emmers, and I think he's going to be a solid parlay piece. Shanna Dobson versus Casey O'Neill, where Dobson's going to be the plus 122 underdog, and O'Neill is going to be the minus 142 favorite. And let's start with Dobson here, where it wasn't too long ago she was about a plus 1,000 underdog going into that fight against Maria Agapova, and honestly, I'm kind of glad that Agapova lost that, right? Like, she was the one who called out Dobson, thinking that she could get an easy layup fight, get that highlight reel KO, and was completely just overlooked Dobson in that fight. Completely blew her load in that first round, trying to get that knockout, but ended up completely gassing herself out and had nothing to offer in that second round, where she ended up just getting finished because she wasn't able to do anything, and she completely deserved it for overlooking Dobson in that fight. But honestly, good on Dobson for weathering the storm early and just toughing it out and eventually turning the tables in that second round. But as far as what Dobson brings to the table, it's not much if I'm going to be honest. But, she's got mainly throws 1-2s, occasional leg kicks, pretty typical of just low-level women's MMA striking there. I will hand it to her, though. She does have a nice jab. Is kind of, I guess, quick for the division. I wouldn't say like lightning quick or anything. Maybe above average speed. It's pretty strong. Has good, size in that division as well. And, will occasionally mix in the takedown, although that's not really a part of her game. And that'll pretty much sum up what Dobson does well, right? More or less, she is a bit of a punching bag in the division. Not particularly good striking. Very, very basic. Not good defensively. But it's low level women's MMA, right? It's the division super shallow. I don't think there's a massive skill gap at the lower part of the division. But taking a look at what O'Neal does, wasn't able to find too much tape on her, but it does look like she's more of a grappler. I mean, she is training out of Tiger Muay Thai, so she's definitely been working on her striking. But from what I've seen so far, she definitely seems way more comfortable on the ground. That being said, though, she is gonna be the one that is gonna be much smaller in this division, right? Well, they're fighting at 125, but O'Neal is typically fighting at 115, and I gotta say, that's pretty concerning going into this matchup. O'Neal is not a big 115er or not a big straw weight, and she'll be fighting at 126, where Dobson is a legit 125er, right? I don't think there's a scenario where Dobson's going to be making 115, and she's got a pretty big frame on her, so it's not like she's just a flabby 115er. I think Dobson is a legit 125er, so O'Neal's going to be giving up a good amount of size and strength in this fight. And taking a look at some of O'Neal's other fights, it looked like she was struggling a little bit against Matano early in that fight, where Matano, honestly, I believe, was the smaller fighter. She was giving O'Neal a lot of trouble in the grappling, but O'Neal did end up pulling ahead later in the fight. I think maybe the physicality of it really ended up getting to Matano, where Matano wasn't able to fight off O'Neal for the full 3 rounds and just started to tire as the fight went on. So I maybe do favor O'Neal a bit more in with the cardio, but she's given up a ton of size. I think the only way that O'Neal's going to be able to win this here is to take the fight to the ground and control Dobson there for extended periods of time, which honestly I think is a bit of a tough ask because of the size difference. O'Neal isn't particularly technical in my opinion. She was able to backpack her most recent opponent, Christina Steliou, I think that's her name. But yeah, she did good work against her there, but I mean, pretty low-level opponent, and if O'Neal isn't able to get the fight there to the ground, I think Dobson's going to be giving O'Neal a ton of trouble on the feet. She's the slightly taller fighter. I believe has the longer reach too. Couldn't find anything on O'Neal's reach, but I do have to assume that Dobson has the reach advantage as well as the height advantage. So O'Neal is definitely going to have to get this fight to the ground, I think, to have the best shot at winning. But even then, I think it's going to be a tough task for her. Again, it's just mainly the size. So, if I did have to make a pick here, I think I'm going to have to lean more towards Dobson, which, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I just think that Dobson's going to be giving O'Neal a lot of trouble on the feet. Also, this is going to be O'Neal's UFC debut, and as bad as I think Dobson is, she has been fighting UFC level competition, whereas O'Neal, I don't think she has. She's fought pretty low level fighters on the regional scene. So I think O'Neal does have a lot to prove here, and again, just the size advantage is I think going to be very, very real here. So the pick here is Dobson, but not very confident in it. I don't really think Dobson is that good, but I do think that she could squeak out a decision here. Again, not confident on it, and definitely not betting this. Rafael Alves versus Pat Sabatini, and Rafael Alves is going to be the minus 185 favorite here against Sabatini, who is the plus 160 underdog. And this is a pretty exciting fight between two UFC debutantes. And let's start with Alves here, right? So Alves, this guy's got big power. He's very aggressive, likes to pressure opponents, loves to back him up against the cage and start just swinging on him. He's got a lot of power in his hands, a lot of power in his legs, and has a really aggressive submission game. He'll attack the guillotine choke pretty aggressively. This guy is pretty dangerous everywhere. This guy is a big, muscular dude, so it just makes his striking and submission game that much more dangerous. But on the flip side of that, it also means his gas tank is definitely in question here, or at least it's something that's in play, right? While I haven't seen him really gas out. I definitely have seen his output start to fall off as the fight goes on, especially in the second or third round. But with that being said, I mean, he still is dangerous going into that second round. His power is still definitely there. As we've seen, he's had a few or a number of second round knockouts or chokes, or even third round chokes that are on his record here. I also think that he has fought the higher level opponents, or at least the better opponents, in my opinion, which makes it kind of impressive that he has been able to finish these guys at a pretty high clip. That being said, though, I'm not sure if he is going to be able to finish Sabatini here. So taking a look at Sabatini, he's a tough guy, and he doesn't come off as the chinny type. In fact, he might actually be too tough for his own good, right? So the reason I say that is because he did have a loss to James Gonzalez in that fight due to an arm injury, where he did get an armbar locked in, or he was locked into an armbar, and he just didn't tap. And what ended up happening was that his arm just ended up, I don't know if it was a breakage or if it was just a really nasty dislocation, but his arm was just completely sideways in that fight, and he ended up actually coming back about 7 months later. So pretty quick turnaround considering just the nasty injury that it was, and was actually able to knock out Jordan Titoni with that right hand, that same right hand that got fucked up in his previous fight, and then was able to turn it around another 3 months later and got an armbar win against Jesse Stern. So Sabatini, he's a tough fighter, and as far as what he does well, I mean, I like how he looks on the feet. He's pretty light on the feet, pretty good movement, lots of feints, and seems to be pretty quick too, but we'll throw a lot of spinning attack. Well, not a lot, but he'll mix in the spinning attacks occasionally. But I guess the bread and butter of his game is really just the submissions, the ground game. He'll like to kind of press opponents up against the cage, kind of just grind them out a little bit before getting the trip and taking them down. As far as what he does on the ground, well, he's really aggressive with the submissions, or he can be aggressive. He'll lay a bit of ground and pound really just to stay busy and make it look like to keep the ref from breaking him apart, and then look for the submission if it's there. But more often than not, he'll like to hold position, hold control time, and either grind out the decision, but more often than not, he will look for the submission later in the fight as his opponents start to tire, and that's what I really like about Sabatini, right? He's got a pretty good gas tank. He's fought in these fights where he's gone to 4 rounds. It's really weird. I think in some of these fights they do 4 rounds where if it looks like it might be tied, then they'll fight that 5th round. But if you go 4 rounds and you're up 3 rounds, and they end up just calling in on the 4th round, I'm not too sure how that works out. But he's definitely gone to a decision. He's gone more than 3 rounds fighting his grindy grappler type of style, and so I do favor Sabatini in the gas tank department. But as far as how this fight will play out, I actually do kind of favor Sabatini in this fight. I don't know if I feel like the line is a little wide with Alves being the -185 favorite here. Both guys making their UFC debut. Alves, again, he is the more explosive fighter. He is a bit more dangerous on the feet. He's got dangerous, offensive BJJ, but it does look like he has a number of losses on his record via submission. So defensively, maybe he's not as good. Maybe if he's the one that's on bottom, or if he's the one being pressured, being attacked here, he might not be as good as he is offensively. So that's definitely something to consider. But again, back to how this fight will play out, I do favor Sabatini because while Alves may be the more powerful and explosive guy, I do favor the fight style of Sabatini. I think maybe in the first round we'll see Alves likely put the pressure on Sabatini early. But if Sabatini is able to survive and weather that first round, I think the gas tank of Alves it'll start to dwindle a bit, and that's really when Sabatini is going to start doing his work. He'll likely start to pin Alves up against the cage, grind him out, make him really work. So to just drain his gas tank, drain his arms out a bit, take away some of that power, and really start to work some of his control. and maybe line a bit of ground and pound in there and start attacking his own submissions. Because as we've seen, Alves does have a number of submission losses. So I think if Sabatini brings the fight to Alves, I definitely think he has a shot here. So as long as Sabatini isn't too caught up in the moment, doesn't respect the power of Alves too much, where he's starting to get a little timid, I think he's got a good shot in this. I don't know if he wants to start out strong, but I definitely think he shouldn't let Alves just try and run away with it early. He should establish himself some, but I think as the fight goes on, I think Sabatini's got a really good shot at winning the decision or even getting the submission here. So I think I'm going to have to go with Sabatini here in terms of a pick. I am really tempted to take a shot on Sabatini, but again, I really have to pick my spots a little bit better after, going 4 straight weeks losing like this. So I might have to pass on this, but I really like Sabatini in this spot, and I'm going to see how this fight plays out. Maybe we'll have another chance to hop on the Sabatini train a little later. But as far as the pick goes, I'm going to have to go with Sabatini. No bet just yet, again, but I am really tempted to. Julian Erosa versus Nate Landwehr. And Julian Erosa is the minus 120 favorite here, whereas Nate Landwehr is the plus 100 even money dog. And where the fight is lined right now, I think it's pretty fair, and I'll tell you guys why. So Erosa, he's a tall, lanky fighter, but he's not super effective with using his range at all. He does seem to have a bit of pop in his punches, but again, he doesn't do a good job of using his range, his lankiness. And, he has a nice front and head kick, but he throws a lot of wild hooks and leaves his chin exposed quite a bit. And that's the worst part, right? Because I think he's particularly chinny. He's been knocked out 3 times in the UFC and a number of other times outside of it. I think he's been knocked out on the Ultimate Fighter and a couple times even on the regional scene. For someone as tall as he is, you really want to see him throw his jab a lot more, throw more kicks, more front kicks, but no, he loves to box in the pocket, loves to exchange there, throw lots of wild hooks, and leaves his chin just out there. I mean, this guy is literally the definition of a glass cannon. I'd say he has pretty good offensive striking, but his defense and durability are just completely not there. He's very hittable and extremely chinny. He's also been in and out of the UFC and has had some good performances and some terrible performances, like knocking out Jamal Emmers, which I think is pretty solid, and then dropping 3 in a row to Devontae Smith, Grant Dawson, Julio Arce, and then was able to pick up a win outside of the UFC, came back and then pick up a win against Sean Woodson as a massive underdog as well. So this guy is all over the place, super inconsistent, and honestly pretty unreliable. With Erosa, you just don't know which fighter's going to show up. And on the other hand, you have his opponent, Nate Landwehr, where you more or less do know which guy's going to show up. I mean, Landwehr is an absolute wild man. He loves to scrap and honestly is pretty fun to watch. He's super aggressive, likes to pressure, and really is happy to take one to land one. And, that's just the fighter he is. You know what you're going to get out of him. You know that's what he's going to do every single fight. However, the way he fights makes a lot of fights get a lot closer than they should be. The fact that, he'll be happy to take damage to give damage makes it so that a lot of his fights are pretty back and forth. And when it comes down to the judges' scorecards, it's going to be hard giving him the nod when he's taken as much damage as he's given. So for that reason, I do believe that this fight is really fairly lined, because this is more or less a pick'em fight, right? So you have Erosa, who's super unreliable, and then you have Landwehr, who's a wild man who, will go back and forth with you and make fights a lot closer than they should. So you don't know how that's going to be scored on the judges' scorecards, right? So in terms of how this matchup will go, though, I do like the striking of Erosa a little better. He is the taller fighter, even though, like I said before, he's not really good at using his range. I do think that his striking is a little crisper. His technique is a little tighter. Nate, he just likes to move forward and kind of wing bombs and trade with you. What I don't agree with here is that they have Erosa being the slight favorite here, whereas I would line Landwehr to be the slight favorite, just because of his durability here. Because especially since if these fights get a little, brawly, I think that Landwehr is going to be the one who has the KO upside, whereas Erosa, I mean, he does have quite a bit of power, and Nate, he's shown a ton of durability, but he has been rocked before, and he has been knocked out once, and that was against Herbert Burns, where it was a knee to the face. So anyone could get knocked out to a knee to the face, but we don't know how that has affected him. If it's kind of loosened things up a bit, if potentially his chin might be cracked. So that's a little bit of an uncertainty, but I'd still give the durability factor to Landwehr here. Maybe they're giving the experience advantage to Erosa, where he is 24-8, and he could be a vet at this point, but he just hasn't had really that much success in the UFC. He does well in the regional scene, but once it gets to the UFC, he's had very very subpar performances there. But for Landwehr, he's been the champ at M1, which I believe is a pretty solid organization. I think that maybe Landwehr has slightly tougher competition, whereas Erosa has a ton of experience. So if I had to make a pick, I would actually lean more towards Landwehr, because I think that he's the more durable fighter, and the way I see the fight playing out, I think that he'll be the one pressuring and backing Erosa up to the fence. Erosa does have a pretty dangerous head kick, and again sits down on his punches quite a bit, but I think that if Landwehr is honestly just able to bite down and start swinging and brawling with Erosa, he might be able to catch him. And with the questionable chin of Erosa, I definitely think that he could get the knockout here. And the only reason I'm not higher on Landwehr right now is that he had a really, really close fight with Darren Elkins and barely won that, in my opinion, which wasn't a good look. Like, I think the main reason Elkins lost was because of his scar tissue. It was a really back and forth fight, and I think what won it for Landwehr was the fact that Darren Elkins was all busted up, but he was giving Landwehr a lot of trouble. So if Elkins didn't have all that scar tissue, I think there's a good chance he could have won that fight. And so going against Erosa, I think that if Landwehr doesn't get the knockout, which he could, the Erosa's super chinny, but if it does go to a decision, I do think that Erosa will have been the one that landed more significant shots and maybe the more damaging shots. But I definitely do give the KO upside to Landwehr here. So I think in terms of lining it, I'd probably flip it, maybe minus 120 Landwehr and plus 100 Erosa here. But I just don't see too much value on this line. So if I had to make a pick here, I'm going to go with Landwehr, but not super confident, and will definitely not be betting versus John Casteneda. And Wineland's going to be the plus 104 underdog here, and Casteneda is the minus 124 favorite. And let's start with Eddie Wineland. Right, this guy, he's got a really fascinating fight style. The way he's got his hands down, wide stance, very interesting the way he fights. But he does like to back his opponents down, has a decent jab and pretty good head movement. But honestly, just the most dangerous part about him is just that right hand. We'll mix it up to the body, but a lot more often than not, he's going to be loading up on that right hand, and has quite a bit of power in there. But it does seem that recently he's only been beating just pretty low-level guys, loses to guys that are a little bit better. The Sean O'Malley, well, I guess Sean O'Malley's a pretty decent prospect still, but Alejandro Perez, John Dodson, I guess these guys are all pretty solid guys. So he's losing to solid UFC fighters, but he's beating like low-level guys like Grigory Popov, an older Frankie Saenz, Takeya Mizugaki. So Wineland, I think he still got it. He's just gonna be struggling against some of these middling UFC fighters. Casteneda, on the other hand, I honestly don't have a great read on him. He's only had one UFC fight, and which he lost to Nathaniel Wood, who, again, I don't have a great read on either. I don't think Wood is that good. I think he's a decent fighter, but yeah, he did have that loss against Wood, but other than that, he's primarily been just a regional guy. And I think it's lined as a pick him for a reason. It's going to be a pretty back and forth fight. If I had to say something about Castaneda, I guess he's got a pretty well-rounded game. Maybe a bit more well-rounded than Wineland. I don't think he's particularly super effective on the ground or anything. I think he's just able to mix it up a little bit better. He does incorporate the leg attacks a little more than Wineland, but more or less, this will largely just be a stand-up fight where both guys are probably just going to be trading most of the fight. And honestly, it's going to be a pretty close fight in that regards. I think it could go either way. But if I had to pick a side, I think that since I do believe that Wineland would probably be the guy that's pressuring, probably landing the harder shots, I think that the decision will likely go to him. And, I do favor the experience a bit more on Wineland's side. He's fought the who's who of the division. And, whereas Casteneda, he's really just only made his. I mean, he has a decent amount of fights under his belt, but it's largely just out of the regional scene. Pretty low level guys, whereas Wineland's fought the who's who of the division. And I guess, you could say that Wineland is a little bit older, a little less durable, and is coming off of a pretty nasty knockout loss to O'Malley. But I think he's had sufficient time to recover. He has been knocked out before too, so I don't know if that'll play too big of a factor. I mean, he is getting a little older. Sean O'Malley is a pretty accurate striker. Say what you will about him, but not much to say about this fight. I think it's a pretty close one, and I don't have a solid read on it. So I am just gonna have to lean more towards Wineland. I favor his experience a little more, and I think the fact that maybe he'll be the one pressuring, landing the cleaner shots, that he'll likely be the one who wins the decision here. So. The pick here is Wineland. Again, not super confident about this fight, and most likely won't be touching this from a betting perspective. Drakkar Klose versus Luis Pena, and this one, Pena is filling in on short notice. He's the plus 170 underdog against Drakkar Klose, the minus 200 favorite. Originally, this was supposed to be Drakkar Klose versus Jai Herbert, but Herbert withdrew, so Pena is stepping in on short notice. But taking a look at Klose and some of his most recent fights, we do have his fight against Derrick, where I don't know, you guys probably remember this. He got backpacked for most of the first round, and then was able to hurt Derrick early in the second. But Derrick dug deep, was able to land one on Klose, and eventually get the knockout there. And in the fight before that, he did go against Christos Giagos, where it was a pretty back and forth fight. He got cage pushed for a bit of round one. Got taken down round two, and it looked like he was going to tap at certain points, but he was able to get out of it and actually hurt Giagos, which I think won him the round, and was able to dig deep in the third, even though Giagos was pretty gassed at that point. And what I really liked about that was Klose showed a lot of resiliency and toughness up until that point. I mean, even though he did eventually get knocked out by Derrick, Derrick has been on an absolute tear and has shown that he has a bit of power in his hands. So not going to hold that too much against Klose. But before that, Klose has shown a lot of toughness. And in the fight before that, he did go up against Bobby Green, where, if you just look at UFC stats, you'll think that Green got absolutely robbed. But in the fight, it was actually pretty back and forth, and it seemed pretty close. And I don't think that there was a big discrepancy in the striking, at least from a visual standpoint. But it was a close fight. I think that Green definitely won the second round. The one in rounds 1 and 3 were a bit of a toss up, but I think what would happen was the judges did just give the nod to to Klose, since he was the one pressuring, and Green also had a pretty nasty cut. So maybe the judges just gave it to him based off of just the visuals, and that really kind of sums up the fight style of Klose, right? Most of the time in a lot of the standing striking exchanges, they come out pretty even, but what he'll do is he'll usually grapple or cage push to kind of win the round, and that really is just his fight style. He makes a lot of fights a lot closer than they should, and for that reason, I don't think I want to be laying minus 200 on Klose here. But as far as what he does well, he has, I think decent striking. I can't get a really good read on it. His shots are a bit loopy, but more often than not, he is able to find the mark. He has pretty nice body and head kicks. Oftentimes, though, he does leave himself open to counters. In a number of his fights, I have noticed that he'll throw a naked leg kick and will get countered. He doesn't have particularly good wrestling or grappling, but he will cage push and grapple at usually at the end of the round to likely secure the decision. And really, like I've said before, that's just how he fights. He's basically a decision machine. And a lot of the times the stand for in regards to the stand up, it'll be pretty back and forth. I don't think he's ever really impressed me or really the judges in that matter for with the striking. But usually it's just the control time near the end of the round that he's able to win these decisions. And taking a look at Pena, so right off the bat, this guy, he's a pretty lanky fighter, and he does use his length pretty well in my opinion. He has a nice jab, nice straight left, good front kick, flying knee up the middle. He's really good at just using his length and all the weapons available to it really well. He has a little bit of that tall man's defense where he'll just be pulling his head back instead of blocking with his hands. I do find him to be a little hittable at times. He does tend to incorporate a bit of wrestling into his game too. Although I'd say his top or even back control isn't particularly good. He doesn't, well, actually, he has good control. He's just not really good at landing any sort of volume when he does have that control. More often than not, he'll just be backpacking a guy or just laying on top of him, like we saw in his fight with, let's see here, against Steve Garcia, where Steve Garcia was coming in on short notice, and Pena just played it really safe and really just took his backpacked him for 3 rounds, and didn't really do much. Like, if you take a look at some of the stats, he only landed 27 significant strikes over 3 rounds. So he's not very active when he does have either top control or his back. And taking a look at some of his other fights too, we see against Frivola, where Frivola came out really strong, did a good amount of damage in the first round. Probably tired a little out in the second round, where Pena was able to come back a bit, and then in the third round, I think that was really the round that was a bit of a toss-up, where again Frivola started strong early in the third round, and then Pena finished the third round strong. So depending on how the judges saw that, you could have scored it either way. So it was a split decision loss for him, and I'm not too upset about that. It's just it was a really close fight, and against Worthy, it was started similarly in the first round, where Worthy started off a little bit quicker, was able to land, was having a bit of success with the leg kicks, and then in the second round, Pena was able to take Worthy down. Didn't do too much again. He was just a lot of control time, but wasn't able to do too much damage, and that seems to be the story with Pena here. A lot of control time, but not particularly a lot of volume. And then in the third round, he did get caught in a guillotine. So overall, I'd say Pena is a pretty well-rounded fighter. He just needs to work on a bit of his ground and pound a little, but he's got decent striking, decent wrestling. But as far as how this fight is going to go, I do have to slightly favor Klose here, because he is the one coming in with a full training camp, and his fight style is really annoying to deal with, especially from like a point standpoint. Like, he'll keep it real close on the feet. I think Pena might have a slight advantage. His striking does seem to be a little more crisp, a little tighter. But I'll have to favor Klose if he does decide to go shoot a takedown or decide to just pin Pena up against the fence. I definitely think that Klose will be the stronger guy. But at minus 200, it's really hard to lay that sort of chalk on Klose here, especially since a lot of his fights play out really close. I definitely see a scenario where Pena is able to pull ahead with some of the striking, and the cage pushing and grappling of Klose might not be enough to win it in some of the judges' eyes. And honestly, with a lot of close decisions that Drakkar has gone to, it definitely could have swung the other way, and he could be due for a close split decision loss in this fight. The only concern I do have is the short notice nature of the fight for Pena. But with that being said, though, I do also see another scenario where Pena might just take Klose down, maybe backpack him for a couple of rounds, and just win on the judges' scorecards that way. So as far as a pick goes, though, I am going to have to side with Klose. I think having a full training camp, being able to just grind up on Pena, I think he'll be able to edge out a decision here. But I don't think I'm going to touch this from a betting standpoint. I think it's definitely dog or pass here. I think Pena definitely has some path to victory, and the way that Klose fights, it leaves him open to getting split decisioned. Jared Gordon, the pick here is close, but Danny Chavez, and Jared Gordon is going to be the plus 120 underdog here, while Chavez is the minus 140 favorite. And let's take a look at Jared Gordon first. So, I mean, I think he's a pretty straightforward fighter. Not particularly good on the feet. His best work is really done on the ground. I mean, his striking isn't terrible, but yeah, again, his strength is really just getting his opponents down to the ground and really just getting control time and working the ground and pound. And he is going to be the guy with more UFC experience in this fight. He is 4-3 in the UFC, and if you just kind of look at some of the guys he's lost to, like Charles Oliveira and Diego Ferreira, not particularly bad, but he has a loss against Joaquim Silva, who I'm not super high on, but this guy, I mean, hits like a truck, so you do have to take that into account. And but if you take a look at some of the other guys he's beaten, Michel Quinones, Hecron Diaz, Dan Morit, Chris Fishgold, not very high-level guys. And, so it's really hard to get a real good read on just where Jared Gordon really stands in the division. I think he'll give some fighters issues in the UFC, but any striker with decent takedown defense is going to give Jared Gordon a lot of trouble. And I do think that Chavez could be that fighter. Chavez isn't a high-level striker by any means, but dude puts a lot of power in his shots and seems to have pretty good takedown defense. He was able to stuff all of the takedowns of TJ Brown, who is primarily a wrestler, and he was able to do a good amount of damage on TJ Brown as well. I think he dropped him a few times, so he's definitely got some power in his hands there. And that's just the type of fighter that Chavez is, right? He's not a particularly high volume fighter, but he puts a ton of heat on all of his shots. Pretty good speed, pretty good power, and he was throwing some really, really nasty leg kicks against TJ Brown that eventually dropped him, I think, and had TJ Brown just limping and backing up a good amount of that fight. And he was pretty good at mixing up the shots to the body, to the leg, and to the head. So he did not discriminate at all from where he was targeting. He doesn't really throw any combinations or a lot of volume for that matter, but he does put a lot of power into the shots that he does throw. So I do have to favor Danny Chavez here. I think he'll be landing the heavier shots, the cleaner shots, and likely just doing much more damage on the feet. And something to consider with Jared Gordon is he has been finished 3 times in the UFC already, and I definitely think the durability is going to be an issue going into this fight. And honestly, I think that Gordon's chin may be shot, and I don't think he'll be able to eat too many clean shots from Chavez, especially with the power that Chavez puts behind it. Gordon might have some success if he takes the fight to the ground, but seeing how well Chavez was able to defend the takedowns against Brown, I think Gordon's going to have a really tough time getting the fight to the ground. That being said, though, it didn't seem like Brown really was selling out for the takedowns that fight. I think the damage might have been done early, and it was really hard for him to consistently go in without taking any damage. But if Gordon is able to sell out for the takedown early, I think he could give Chavez some problems. But if not, I think that Chavez is going to be able to touch up Gordon pretty badly in this fight. So if Gordon isn't able to get the takedown early and just establish himself early, I think that there's a good chance that Chavez will do a ton of damage to Gordon and most likely be able to knock him out. But as far as the pick goes, I am going to have to go with Chavez here. I think he's going to keep it standing long enough to eventually get Gordon out of there. So the pick is Gordon, and I think I'm going to end up placing a 1.4 unit bet on Chavez. I haven't locked it in yet, but if I do, I will post it on my Bet MMA tips page. But out of all the bets out of all the fights that I've gone over so far, I do like this one the most. So the pick is Chavez and Arlovski versus Tom Aspinall here, and Arlovski is going to be the plus 210 underdog, and Aspinall is going to be the minus 250 favorite. And right off the bat, I think a lot of people are looking at this fight thinking it's going to be kind of similar to the Tanner Boser fight with Arlovski, and I don't think that's 100% the case. I mean, I do see the similarities in that Boser and Aspinall are the younger fighters coming in on a bit of a hot streak, and Boser was a pretty sizable favorite in that fight, same with Aspinall in this fight. And the big difference I see here is that Aspinall does appear to be the the harder striker here, right? Whereas Boser, he's more of like a volume guy. And, in that fight, it was an absolute stinker, to be honest. Very low volume fight. Boser wasn't really doing anything. He was just kind of dancing around, throwing a few leg kicks, very few punches in there. And Arlovski ended up stealing the decision, just because he was able to land the harder strikes, whereas Aspinall or Boser was only able to land a few pitter-patter leg kicks. Boser was a bit timid in that fight and didn't look like he really wanted to commit with any of his shots. I don't think that'll be the case here for Aspinall, but let's take a look at some of Arlovski's previous opponents, though. Arlovski, at this stage in his career, if he's not getting knocked out, he's likely going to take you to a really close decision. And we've seen that in his recent fights against Boser, Linz, Sakai. Really close fights that, he's kind of always just hanging in there. His volume isn't particularly good, but he's always good at kind of just returning shots, hitting you back whenever his opponents do throw. So he's definitely live in that regards, where if you're not getting him out, he'll make it a really close, grindy fight. So for that reason, it's really hard to bet against him, especially at those odds, knowing that if it does go to a decision, he can make it really close. Now, taking a look on the other side, his opponent Tom Aspinall is coming in with a bit of hype and seems to be on quite a bit of a hot streak. So far, he's had a 100% finish rate, and it doesn't look like any of his fights have gone past the first round, except for his fights against Parobiec, where he did get the loss, but it was because it was an illegal 12-6 elbow that he was throwing. Anyways, what I was trying to get to is that this guy does look like he has quite a bit of power, but you do have to consider that he's been fighting pretty low-level guys, right? A lot of these guys on the regional scene are not that good, and if you think that the UFC has a pretty shallow heavyweight division, you can only imagine what the heavyweight division is like outside of the UFC, and all these regional promotions. So my main concern with Aspinall coming into this fight is that he hasn't really had any fights go outside of the first round. We don't really know how his cardio is going to look going into the second and third round, and really how he's going to look taking a step up in competition, because even as far as the UFC goes, he's only fought two guys, Jake Collier, who was coming in way overweight after taking a long break off, and Alan Badeau, who's really a freak show fighter. That being said, though, he did actually drop Collier, and Collier did end up having a fight with Jean Vellante and ate quite a few bombs from him and was able to keep going. So you have to wonder, really, if the power of Aspinall is legit. I mean, he's taking a lot of guys out. So, and as far as we know, Arlovski is a bit chinny, and he is getting knocked out, but it is to these power punchers, like to Rosenstrike and Ngannou and Overeem. So we really have to wonder, I mean, is Aspinall at that level yet, or is his power at that level? I'm not 100% sold yet. This is a pretty big step up in competition for Aspinall. But as far as what he does well, it does, again, he looks like he has some power in his shots. He does mix in the takedowns pretty well, and he has a pretty solid leg kick. And unlike Boser in that fight, I think Aspinall is going to be moving forward. He's going to be aggressive. But again, the main concern really is just this is a pretty big step up in competition, and we really haven't seen Aspinall outside of the first round. Like, he's coming off of two quick wins against Jake Collier and Alan Badeau, and now he's making a pretty big step up in competition against Arlovski. I believe there are a lot of middling heavyweights in there that he could have taken a fight against to really kind of gauge how he stands in the heavyweight division. But I do think that he should be able to get it done. I really like what I've seen so far from him. He does seem like he has all the tools to succeed at heavyweight. I'm just not sure if he's got enough cage time to make that big leap just yet. However, he does train with guys like Darren Till and Mike Grundy, who are UFC level, and so I trust that they are giving him the proper looks in the gym. So the pick here is going to be Aspinall, but I'm not ready to hop on the train yet, and going up against someone like Arlovski, who is a crafty vet and who I have said before will make it a close fight if Aspinall isn't able to get him out there, I'm not sure I'm ready to lay that minus 250 on Aspinall just yet. But as far as the pick goes, I am going to have to go with Aspinall
Imavov versus Phil Hawes.
I don't think I want to bet pretty on much a pick'ems fight where Imavov is minus 115 and Phil Hawes is minus 105. And I did actually do a breakdown on this before, but I'll do it again. And it's going to be pretty similar to my previous breakdown. But let's start with Imavov here. He's 5-0 in his last five and did win his UFC debut against Jordan Williams, which, before that I wasn't able to find too much tape. But let's breaking down that fight. It was against Jordan Williams, who was diabetic, and definitely did seem to show in that fight because Williams gassed pretty hard outside of the first. That being said, there was a nut shot and a clash of heads in that fight. Both fighters, really grinded it out. Showed a lot of heart and toughness in that fight, which, is good on Imavov's end as well. He was also making his UFC debut, so I cut him a bit of slack there. Before that, though, he did get matched up against Jonathan Munier. Was able to drop him with a straight right in that fight, and did follow up with some ground and pound. And again, what I really liked that I saw from that fight was he did stay pretty composed. He didn't rush the TKO. He was really just picking his shots before eventually getting him out of there, and you really do like to see that, especially coming from a really young guy. They didn't rush for the finish, didn't blow his load, didn't gas himself out trying to get the other guy out of there. As far as what he does well, though, he does have a nice jab and straight right, but doesn't seem to offer too many looks outside of that. He is a pretty young fighter, though, so I do think he'll be making a lot of improvements. Something else to consider for Imavov, though, is he does have a pretty sneaky submission game, in my opinion. In his fight against Williams, he did have a few nice transitions. I mean, he had a good guillotine into figure four lock that he used against him. And looking at his record, he does have a number of subs on his record. So he does seem like a pretty opportunistic submission guy. So, if a limb or a neck is, left out in the open, he will snatch it up. We'll look for the submission there. But that was really all I was able to find on Imavov. I only found two of his fights, the Jonathan Munier fight and then his fight against Jordan Williams. So wasn't able to get too much tape on him. But as far as Hawes goes, he is 5-0 in his last five. Prior to that, he was on the Ultimate Fighter and the Contender Series twice with an overall record of 1-2 in those fights. So not very good when it comes to fighting potentially UFC level competition. And he was able to make his UFC debut after winning his second Dana White Contender Series event against Kadzimierat Besteyev, who honestly I believe is pretty bad. If you flip through his record, he's primarily only beaten 3-0 or negative, or guys with negative records. And then for his UFC debut, Phil Hawes got matched up against Jacob Malkoun, who honestly isn't UFC caliber. The dude, I think, had like 4 fights under his belt and really was only on the card because Whitaker was on the card, and he's training partners with Whitaker, so I think they did him a solid, put him on the card. But he absolutely didn't look like he belonged in there. He was super tentative and basically got destroyed by Phil Hawes early. And for some reason, he was only a minus 200 favorite there. I think it's just because nobody had any trust in Hawes, and it makes sense because Hawes does have that cardio issue, and he's just been a very unreliable fighter. And if you kind of just flip through the record of Phil Hawes, just go through some of his fights, you can see that he did lose via head kick to Julian Marquez, where he got absolutely obliterated in that fight. It was a really nasty knockout, honestly. And after that, he was able to bounce back and was able to go on a 5-fight win streak. I think all 5 of them he was able to win via knockout. And most of those fights he was able to get out of there in the first round. So we haven't really seen too much development from Phil Hawes. We know that he has power in his hands, but if the fight does get out of the first round, we really don't know if his gas tank has improved at all or if he's really developed any other part of his game. But from previous fights, we do know that he has wrestling to go back to. Super heavy hands, super explosive striking. But again, it's the gas tank that really is in question here, right? But looking at this matchup, though, I think it does play out pretty close. And I think when the line opened up previously, Phil Hawes was a pretty sizable, moderate favorite. I think he was like minus 150 or so, maybe even a little higher. But it seems like Imavov's been getting a ton of love. I think people are really just fading the gas tank of Phil Hawes. And definitely, that is definitely something to be concerned with and should consider going into this fight. But I think that overall, though, Hawes is probably, I think, the better fighter. I think he's got the knockout potential. Obviously, the the power in his hands. And I think if it does get out of that first round, if he's able to pace himself well enough, I think that the wrestling will play a factor here. So as far as how the fight will go, I do think that Hawes likely will start out strong. Maybe he'll be the one pressuring Imavov. He'll probably try and swing a few bombs. But, if he isn't able to get Imavov out of there, I think it's going to be a pretty close going, outside of that first round. But, seeing Imavov go up against Jordan Williams, he was pretty gassed himself. So I'm not 100% sold on the gas tank of Imavov either. So I think going into that second round or even third round, I think that it's going to get pretty sloppy. And if that happens, I am going to have to lean more towards Hawes and his grappling. I think the guy who's got the better wrestling is going to be the one, dictating where the fight's going to go. And if Imavov isn't able to get out of those grappling exchanges, he could very well find himself on his back for extended periods and lose lose minutes and likely lose a decision if he isn't able to get out of that. But that being said, though, I do think that the submission threat of Imavov might be live here, especially if Hawes gets a little sloppy or he gets a little too tired, leaves his neck out or a limb out. Imavov will snatch it up and try and get that submission. But this is going to be a pretty sloppy fight in my opinion. Both guys still pretty unproven. But if I did have to pick a side, I would have to go with Hawes and his the potentially his knockout potential and the wrestling threat that he has. That being said, though, Imavov does have pretty good accuracy, nice straight right, and if Hawes gets tired, if he gets gassed out there, is a chance that Imavov will find the mark and knock him out. But where it sits now, I do favor Hawes, and it seems like a lot of love is coming in on Imavov. So if the line starts to move more and I can get dog odds on Hawes, I might put a unit on him. But as of right now, he is sitting at minus 105. So I'm going to wait on that a little bit. But as far as a pick goes, I'm going to have to go with Hawes. And then from as far as a bet goes, I'm going to wait to see if we can get plus odds on Hawes. If I can get like maybe plus 110 or even better, plus 120, I'll likely pull the trigger on him. Oleinik versus Chris Daukaus. And Chris Daukaus is going to be the minus 190 favorite here. And the comeback on Oleinik is going to be plus 165. And this is another heavyweight bout where we have an up-and-coming prospect against a battle-tested vet. And in both of these fights, we have two prospects that do seem like they have a lot of potential, but haven't really proven themselves in the UFC. They've fought relatively low-level fighters and are honestly making a pretty big jump up in competition. The main difference I do see in this matchup, or in these matchups, is that I feel that Oleinik is much more dangerous than Arlovski. Arlovski's going to try and grind you out for a decision. He's got one gear. He fights at the same pace all fight. And with Oleinik, he's just going to sell out for the submission. And he'll attack that submission early. But the way he fights, though, his wrestling isn't particularly good. He likes to kind of just wing bombs to close the distance, get in on the hips, get in on the legs even, and kind of just drag you down, maybe even try and pull guard. But his wrestling isn't that good. A lot of the times he's just muscling guys out into the ground. From there, he'll work hard to get the submission. His go-to is the Ezekiel choke, but he has a number of submissions that he'll go to. Honestly, he's pretty one-dimensional in that regard. He's going to try and shoot for the takedown and look for the sub, but as far as what he offers on the feet, he's kind of slow. He ducks his head down when he's trying to go in for those haymakers. So he's not very fundamentally sound on the feet. So on the feet, I think he's going to struggle with Daukaus a lot. The question really is if he's able to get Daukaus down and if Daukaus is going to be able to fend off the submission. And that's what makes breaking this fight down so hard, right? Daukaus for sure has the better striking. He's got the crisper boxing. He's got quick hands. And, honestly, he's pretty quick for the heavyweight division. But I'm not 100% sold on Daukaus just yet. He's had a pretty soft schedule in the UFC. He made his UFC debut against Parker Porter. Not very good. And Rodrigo Nascimento. So he's going from fighting these guys to Alexei Oleinik, who's really fought the who's who of the division. He's fought Verdum, Lewis, Walt Harris, Overeem, Mark Hunt. He's fought a ton of big names in the division, while Daukaus, he's barely getting his feet wet against some lower level competition. And let's not forget, we were getting pretty much pick 'em odds on Porter versus Daukaus, when he made his debut, and he was a massive underdog to Nascimento. Now, all of a sudden, he's a decent favorite against Oleinik, who's way better than these guys and is a proven vet. So I feel like there's a bit of an overcorrection in the betting market for this fight. That aside, though, just knowing that Alexei Oleinik is basically sub or bust makes it really hard to want to pick or bet on him, even though, he is really high level and he does have a decent shot at pulling it off. So as far as a pick goes, I'm going to have to side with Daukaus. The fight is going to start standing. He's going to have opportunities to land clean on Oleinik, but if Oleinik is able to close the distance and get his hands on Daukaus, I'm not sure how Daukaus will fare, right? We haven't really seen Daukaus really go up against a strong grappler like Oleinik, and we don't know how Daukaus is going to look once his back is on the ground or once he's got some adversity on the ground. Supposedly he is a black belt and is pretty high level, but we haven't really seen it in the octagon, and so it's kind of hard to really get a read on that. But if he is able to survive that first round and a half or so against Oleinik, history has shown that Oleinik's going to tire out and probably get knocked out. I mean, Daukaus, he's got a good amount of power. He's got really quick hands and pretty good accuracy too. So I think it'll be he'll have a good chance of knocking Oleinik out if Oleinik isn't able to sub him within that first round, maybe early in the second. Honestly, it's a pretty tough fight to call. I don't have a good read on either side. It's hard to kind of quantify how well Oleinik is going to do. Like, how do you assign a probability for how likely that Oleinik is going to get that submission? Because more than likely, if he is going to win, it's by submission. So from a betting perspective, I think the play here is Oleinik by submission. If you are going to take him, I don't think he's going to knock out Daukaus, and I definitely don't think he'll make it to decision. And if he did, I definitely don't think he's going to be winning. He's 43. His gas tank's not great. He's got that old man strength, but that's only going to, help him out for about a round and a half or so before he's completely gasses himself out, especially with the way he attacks these submissions. So, yeah, I think the play here is going to be Oleinik by submission if you did want to play anything, but I'm not completely sold on Daukaus just yet to play him as a favorite, this heavy of a favorite against Oleinik. So the pick here, I think I'm going to have to lean towards Daukaus. I think that, if he is able to survive the submission, he could win. I do think that, when the fight opens up, he has a chance of, catching Oleinik. But, if Oleinik does get his hands on Daukaus, Oleinik is very alive for the submission here. So pick is Daukaus, but not very confident. And from a betting perspective, I think the only realistic play here is Oleinik by submission. And I might actually put a little bit on it, maybe a quarter of a unit on that. But
Derrick
nothing
Minner
too crazy here. Charles Rosa. And Derrick Minner is the plus 155 underdog here. And Charles Rosa is going to be the minus 180 favorite here. So this one is a pretty straightforward one to break down, in my opinion. Pretty simple. Mainly because Minner is as one-dimensional as one-dimensional gets. This guy is basically round one sub or bust. And, essentially he'll sell out for the sub. His go-to is really the guillotine, and likely he will just jump guillotine. But, if he doesn't get it, he is pretty much screwed since, for two reasons. Because if he doesn't get it, he'll be giving up position. He'll be giving up top position when that happens, and since he really sells out for the submission, he'll likely gas himself out. The way he locks in the submission, he's not letting go, and if the opponent doesn't tap, then more than likely he'll gas out his arms. And you see in a lot of his fights, if he doesn't get his opponent out of there in the first round, he'll likely be the one that gets finished in the second round. So the way it usually plays out is either Derrick Minner first round submission or Derrick Minner knocked out or subbed round two. Occasionally he will go to a decision, which he'll lose, but those are the main scenarios that will play out for a Derrick Minner fight. And looking at his opponent, Charles Rosa, people will probably look at his performance against Mitchell and think that since he did go to a decision with Mitchell, and since Mitchell wasn't able to submit him, that he'll likely survive against Derrick Minner and most likely just win a decision or just be able to get him out of there in the second or third round. But I don't think that it's that simple, right? So for one, Rosa almost actually tapped in that fight. I believe it was early in the first where Mitchell had him had him in a tight submission, and he was very close to tapping. But the other point that I want to bring up is that Mitchell wasn't really selling out for the sub. He was really aggressive in attacking different submissions and even landing ground and pound. But Minner, he's going to be attacking a single sub, and he's not going to let go. He's gonna hang on until he essentially gasses out. So I definitely don't think that Rosa is going to be able to 100% defend that sub. I mean, I think more than likely he does, but I wouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that just because he was able to defend multiple submission attempts from Bryce Mitchell that he would be able to do the same against Minner. I think the situation is a little bit different, but at the end of the day, I do think that Rosa should be able to defend that guillotine if it does happen, and more than likely, I think Rosa will have a good enough game plan to really not get into the guard of Derrick Minner or really even get into any grappling exchanges. If I'm Rosa, I want to just game plan to keep the fight standing, kind of just pick him apart on the feet and just stay safe and just hope to win on the scorecards instead of potentially finding himself in a very compromising position. With all that being said, I do think that Rosa should be able to get the win here. He's had a number of UFC fights already, and he's fighting out of American Top Team, and I'm sure they have a great game plan for him. They know that the submission is live for Minner, so if anything, I think I am going to put a bet on Rosa here. I do think that he's going to avoid the submission. He hasn't been subbed before, or at least he hasn't been subbed professionally before. And I know I had my whole spiel about that Bryce Mitchell fight, and I do stand by it. I do think that it's going to be really hard for Minner to get the submission. I think Rosa should be able to game plan around it pretty well. The props for this fight haven't come out yet, but I'm likely going to put a 1.8 unit bet on Rosa here and maybe hedge with like Derrick Minner by first round submission, since that's when he'll be most dangerous. Outside of that, though, I do definitely think that Rosa should be able to win. So the pick here is Rosa, and I will be putting a 1.8 unit bet on Rosa and possibly hedging out with Vieira versus by first round Kunitskaya. And Vieira is going to be the minus 270 favorite here, and the comeback on Kunitskaya is plus 230. And I'm honestly a little surprised this is in the co-main event. Maybe they're trying to hype up one of these chicks to fight Amanda Nunes, whoever wins, but man, I'm not really feeling it for this fight. But I'll do the breakdown for it anyways. I mean, the line's pretty crazy as it is. I don't think it's a good idea to be parlaying Vieira or even playing her straight here. And I don't see too many merits for Kunitskaya either. But, if I did have to, from a betting perspective, this is definitely a dogger pass. But as far as how this fight is going to play out, let's take a look at what Yana Kunitskaya does well. She's primarily a clinch fighter. Her striking isn't particularly good. She does her best work in the clinch where she's landing the knees, landing some elbows, maybe looking for some trips, getting some control time on top. But that's essentially, her game plan. But on the feet, she's very basic, mainly just throwing jabs, 1-2s. Not very tight, not very crisp. So on the feet, if, at distance, I think she's going to struggle a bit against Vieira. But, if she's able to control Vieira up against the cage for extended periods of time, I think, she'll have a bit of success. But I don't think that's too likely. Vieira, I believe, is, the bigger, stronger fighter. Kunitskaya, I feel like only really does well against women or other fighters that she has a physical advantage over, like Renault or Lena Landsberg. But, yeah, I don't know. She just isn't a very interesting or impressive fighter in my opinion. But taking a look at Vieira, I'm not particularly impressed with her either. She's a bit of a longer fighter. She has decent striking, very good straight, rights. But I mean, she has fought very low level fighters as well, and she's squeaking out split decisions in those fights, and she's barely beating Sijara Ubik, who I don't think is that good. As far as what she does well, again, I mean, decent striking, and she does mix in the takedowns. Her striking opens it up pretty well, and she's got decent size on a lot of the chicks in the division. So I guess she's got that going for her. But again, laying minus 270 on her, I don't think it's worth it. And I do see a scenario where Kunitskaya might just get enough control time in the clinch to possibly steal a split decision. But outside of that, I don't see her having too much success anywhere else. I guess if Vieira doesn't really show up, I mean, Kunitskaya might have a shot here, but yeah, the pick here is going to be Vieira, but I don't want to touch finally this made it to the main event. Curtis Blaydes versus Derrick Lewis. Curtis Blaydes, the minus 450 favorite against Derrick Lewis, the plus 350 underdog. And let's start with Lewis. So I definitely feel like Lewis's popularity definitely skyrocketed after that fight against Volkov, where he knocked him out in the last second of that fight. But ever since then, he's kind of just had dud fights again and again. Outside of that Oleinik fight, where he was able to survive that first round against Oleinik and beat him or knock him out early in that second round. But outside of that, he hasn't really been able to deliver in recent fights. I mean, he's seen as this knockout artist, and there's definitely truth to that. But I feel like he's kind of fallen off quite a bit post Alexander Volkov. I mean, he was on his way to getting beat to a pretty dominating decision there, but was able to pull off the upset, or not the upset, but the comeback there. But outside of that, I mean, hasn't had a really good performance since then. Yeah, he did have a knockout against Oleinik, but again, Oleinik really sold out for the submission early, and when he couldn't get it, the power of Lewis was just a bit too much for him. But let's be real here. Oleinik was, I believe, 42 at the time and had been knocked out plenty of times. I mean, good for Lewis for surviving that first round and getting the knockout, but this is clearly not the Lewis of old. With that being said, though, I mean, the power is still there, but it just doesn't seem like the timing or his willingness to pull the trigger is. I mean, he's 36 now, and he just seems a little more apprehensive now in his most recent fights. He's barely throwing anymore, and, it is a bit concerning. He's getting a bit older. His cardio definitely is, I mean, it's never been great, but I don't think it's getting any better at this point. So, yeah, he's hasn't been a very inspiring fighter as of late. Obviously, the knockout is always going to be there. The power is going to be there. But at this point, I definitely feel like it is a bit of a puncher's chance, especially against a Blaydes, who is a very, very dominant wrestler. But taking a look at Lewis, you guys know the deal. He's a high-level wrestler, will chain together takedowns, and has pretty smothering top control. I mean, it's pretty impressive how he's been able to just grind out high-level heavyweights, with the only fighter giving him trouble being Ngannou, who has crazy power, so you can't really hold that against him. Honestly, I feel like there's not too much to break down in this fight. I just think that Blaydes is going to be able to completely just smother Lewis for most of this fight. I don't know if he's going to be able to get him out of there. Possibly. Maybe the ground and pound is going to build up. Maybe get him out. Maybe get Lewis out of there in the third or fourth round. Little hard to call in that regards, but more than likely, I definitely see Blaydes being able to take Lewis down. Like, people talk about Lewis just being able to get up, and I just don't really see him doing that against Blaydes, though. A lot of the time, he isn't really fighting high-level wrestlers when he's doing that. Most of the time, he's just kind of just he's just resting a bit, waiting for an opening to explode up and get up. But against Blaydes, who's a high-level wrestler, he's just going to constantly be putting weight on him. And the second Lewis tries to explode out of his position, Blaydes is just going to chain takedowns together to continue holding him down and really just work the gas tank of Lewis, which has not been great. And even though he's said he's been working on it, I'm not completely sold on it. I mean, the dude is 36, and even if he has made some improvements, I don't think he's all of a sudden going to be a cardio machine at this point. So, especially with the wrestling pressure that Blaydes is going to put on him, I don't think that it's going to have much of an effect for Lewis. And if you kind of just take a look at some of Lewis's fights, he pretty much gets taken down in every one of his fights. And usually it's not even against high-level wrestlers. So against someone like Blaydes, I don't think he's going to have any issue taking him down. I don't think he's going to have any issue holding him down. And the real question is just how Blaydes is going to win, and if he does win, in which round. So as far as the pick goes, I think it's pretty obvious here. I am going to go with Blaydes, and I might just put him in a parlay. I'm really thinking about putting him or Spivak or maybe even Emmers in a parlay, but yeah, the pick is going to be Blaydes, and haven't decided, who I'm going to parlay him up with just yet, but more than likely I will be putting him in a parlay. And something to look at here, though, also is the under 1.5, or not under, sorry, over 1.5. It's minus 185, and I definitely think it's worth taking a stab at. I know it's juiced quite a bit, but I don't think that Lewis is going to be able to get Blaydes out of there early. I think, if anything, Blaydes is just going to grind him out for a few rounds on the ground. I think Lewis is definitely going to be able to survive past that 1.5 round mark. He's pretty tough, but afterwards, his gas tank is going to go, and who knows, Blaydes might be able to get a finish outside of that second or third round. And so again, that'll do it for this podcast. Likely we'll parlay him up, and I'm looking at the over 1.5. I had a lot of fights on this card to break down, but glad I'm finally done with it. Look forward to hopefully making some money, digging myself back out of this hole here. But yeah, that'll do it for this card. I appreciate you guys for listening, hanging in there, and I'll see you guys next time.